Imagine a cold, misty morning in the Scottish Highlands during the late 15th century, where the air is thick with the scent of damp heather and peat smoke. Inside a secluded stone monastery, a monk carefully monitors a primitive copper vessel as a clear, potent liquid trickles slowly into a ceramic jar. To this humble friar, the liquid is not a beverage for social gatherings, but rather a divine medicine believed to prolong life and cure a multitude of ailments. This water of life was the precursor to what we now know as whisky, a spirit that would eventually transcend its medicinal roots to define the cultural identity of a nation. Some historians argue that the secrets of distillation were brought to the British Isles by travelling monks who had ventured as far as the Mediterranean. Records vary regarding the exact date of its arrival, yet the year 1494 stands as a definitive milestone in the written history of this golden elixir. For centuries, the art of distillation remained a closely guarded secret, preserved within the walls of religious institutions, before it finally trickled down to the common people. In the early days of its existence, whisky was known in the Gaelic language as Whisky Beata, a term that translates directly to the water of life. The process of distillation was initially used to extract the essence of flowers and herbs for perfumes, but it soon found a much more visceral application. Had the monks not been so diligent in documenting their agricultural surpluses, we might never have known about the commission given to Friar John Core. The Exchequer Rolls of Scotland from 1494 record that Friar John was granted 8 bowls of malt to make aqua vitae for the king. This entry represents the first official evidence of spirit production in the country, marking the transition of whisky from a localized remedy to a royal interest. During this era, the liquid produced was likely harsh, unaged, and far removed from the smooth, smoky drams enjoyed by modern connoisseurs. It was essentially a raw, potent grain spirit that was consumed immediately after distillation, often flavored with herbs like heather or honey to mask its aggressive bite. Never before had the common farmer realized that their excess barley could be transformed into such a valuable and long-lasting commodity. As the monastic system began to decline, many former monks took their knowledge of distillation to the surrounding farms and villages. Consequently, what was once a sacred craft became a staple of rural life, allowing farmers to preserve their grain through the harsh northern winters. The surplus grain, which would otherwise have rotted in the damp Scottish climate, was effectively bottled to be consumed or traded later. This economic shift meant that distillation became deeply woven into the social fabric of the Highlands and the lowlands alike. By the 16th century, the production of Whisky Beata had become a common sight across the rugged landscape, with small stills appearing in nearly every glen. One popular theory suggests that the portable nature of these stills allowed the craft to survive even in the most remote and inaccessible regions. While the nobility enjoyed fine wines imported from France, the Scottish peasantry found solace and strength in their own locally produced spirit. The spirit was often used as a form of currency traded for livestock tools or labour in an economy where hard cash was frequently scarce. However, the growing popularity of whisky did not escape the notice of the authorities, who were always eager to find new sources of revenue. The government began to recognise that this widely consumed liquid could provide a significant boost to the national treasury through taxation. Therefore, the stage was set for a centuries-long conflict between the rugged independent distillers and the persistent tax collectors of the Crown. Before the introduction of heavy regulations, the distillation process was as much a part of the seasonal cycle as planting or harvesting. Every farmer who possessed a surplus of malted barley had the potential to become a part-time distiller during the quiet winter months. They would gather around the fire sharing stories and songs, while the steady thump-thump of the still provided a rhythmic backdrop to their conversations. These gatherings fostered a sense of community and resilience qualities that would become essential as the legal landscape began to shift. In this chapter, we have encountered terms such as aqua vitae and social fabric, which help describe the historical and cultural origins of the spirit. These expressions are useful for discussing the fundamental components of a society and the historical evolution of specific industries. Try using social fabric when you want to describe the complex connections that hold a community together in your advanced English discussions. If the early distillers had known how globally successful their water of life would become, they might have guarded their recipes even more fiercely. The craft was essentially a response to the environment, a way to turn the rugged earth's offerings into something that could withstand the passage of time. Distillation was a transformative process, turning simple mash into a spirit that supposedly possessed the power to ward off the plague. As the 17th century dawned, the British Parliament began to impose the first of many taxes on malt and spirits, forever altering the industry's trajectory. This intervention would force many distillers into the shadows, giving birth to a legendary era of smuggling and clandestine production. The hills and glens of Scotland would soon become a battleground for those who refused to let the government profit from their ancient traditions. Rarely had a single beverage caused such a profound divide between the law of the land and the customs of the people. The conflict between the excisemen and the moonshiners would go on to shape the very flavour profile of whisky as we know it today. In the next part of our journey, we will explore how these illicit distillers outsmarted the law and why their rebellion was crucial to the spirit's survival. The era of the smuggler's trails was about to begin, and with it a new chapter of defiance and innovation. The struggle for the soul of whisky was just getting started. Imagine a moonlit night in a remote highland glen, where the silence is broken only by the steady bubbling of a hidden copper pot. Somewhere in the darkness, an illicit distiller keeps a watchful eye on the horizon, listening for the rhythmic clip-clop of a tax collector's horse. For over a century, the history of whisky was not written in boardrooms or factories, but in these secret spaces and high-stakes encounters. One popular theory suggests that the characteristic smoky flavour of Scotch was born out of necessity during this era of fugitive production. Distillers had to hide their smoke from the prying eyes of the law, often using small portable stills that could be dismantled and moved at a moment's notice. This was the age of moonshine, a period when the very act of making whisky was a radical gesture of defiance against the British Crown. Had it not been for the stubbornness of these Highland rebels, the diverse flavour profiles we treasure today might have been standardised into oblivion. Following the 1707 Act of Union between Scotland and England, the government sought to consolidate its power by imposing heavy taxes on malt and spirits. This legislation was met with immediate and widespread hostility, as many Scots viewed the tax as an infringement on their ancient sovereignty and traditions. To the Highland farmer, distilling whisky was not just a business. It was a way to pay the rent and survive the biting cold of the northern winters. Consequently, the tax did not stop production. Rather, it pushed the entire industry underground, far away from the reach of the gaugers, or tax collectors. Never before had the Scottish landscape seen such a sophisticated network of smuggling and clandestine commerce. The conflict turned into a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with distillers employing ingenious methods to transport their liquid gold across the country. Some smugglers went so far as to hide barrels of whisky inside mock funeral processions, knowing that few officers would dare to disturb a mourning family. Others utilized hollowed-out loaves of bread or hidden compartments in horse-drawn carriages to evade detection at checkpoints. Ironically, the quality of this illicit moonshine was often far superior to the spirits produced by the government-sanctioned legal distilleries. Legal distillers were forced to use large, inefficient stills and rush the fermentation process to maximize output and minimize their tax burden. In contrast, the Highland smugglers took their time using pure mountain water and high-quality malt to create a product that was highly sought after in the cities. Even the nobility and members of the clergy were known to prefer the flavour of smuggled whisky, often turning a blind eye to the illegal trade. As the 19th century approached, the government began to realise that their heavy-handed approach was failing to generate the expected revenue. Despite the constant threat of fines and imprisonment, thousands of illicit stills continued to operate in the rugged mountains of the north. The situation reached a boiling point when the violence between smugglers and excise officers became a regular occurrence in the Scottish countryside. Rarely had a law created such a profound sense of social division, pitting the common man against the machinery of the state. The sheer scale of the evasion meant that the government was losing millions of pounds in potential taxes every single year. However, a significant turning point arrived in 1823 with the passing of the Excise Act, which sought to bring the industry into the light. This landmark legislation dramatically reduced the cost of a distilling licence and lowered the tax per gallon of spirit produced. It was a pragmatic solution that acknowledged a simple truth: if you make the law fair, people are more likely to follow it. George Smith, a former illicit distiller from the Glenlivet Valley, was the first person to apply for a legal licence under the new Act. While many of his former companions viewed him as a traitor to the cause, Smith recognised that legitimacy was the only path to long-term success. He had to carry a pair of loaded pistols at all times to defend himself and his property from the angry neighbours who opposed the new legal system. Smith's success proved that a legal distillery could produce a world-class spirit that surpassed the quality of the old mountain moonshine. In this chapter, we have utilised phrases like "to turn a blind eye" and high-stakes game of cat and mouse to describe situations involving evasion and avoidance. These expressions are particularly effective when you want to describe complex social dynamics or the tension between law and personal interest in advanced English. Try incorporating infringement on sovereignty into your vocabulary when discussing political or legal boundaries in a formal context. If the 1823 Excise Act had never been passed, the modern Scotch industry might still be a fragmented collection of small-scale operations. The move toward legalization allowed distillers to invest in larger facilities, experiment with maturation, and focus on consistent quality control. The transition from the shadows to the marketplace was not easy, yet it laid the foundation for the global empire that whisky would soon become. Before this era, the idea of aging whisky in oak barrels was largely an accidental discovery made during the long storage periods of the smuggling era. As the industry stabilized, distillers began to notice that the spirit became smoother and more complex after spending time in wood. This realization would eventually lead to the strictly regulated maturation laws that define the industry today. The spirit of rebellion remained, but it was now being channeled into a quest for perfection and international prestige. By the mid-1800s, the moonshine era was fading, replaced by a new generation of entrepreneurs who were ready to take on the world. In our next segment, we will witness how a tiny insect in the vineyards of France and a revolutionary new invention changed the course of whisky history forever. The arrival of the column still was about to spark a revolution that would challenge the dominance of the traditional pot still. A new era of blending and global expansion was just over the horizon. The 19th century was a period of radical transformation, where the clanging gears of the Industrial Revolution met the ancient traditions of the Scottish Highlands. For centuries, the production of whisky had been a slow and rhythmic process, dictated by the capacity of small copper pot stills that could only produce limited batches. However, a sudden wave of technological innovation was about to sweep through the damp valleys of Scotland, forever altering the way the world consumed spirits. Imagine the bustling docks of Victorian London, where crates of wine and brandy were being unloaded by the thousands, while Scotch whisky remained a niche regional curiosity. That was the status quo until a bold Irishman named Aeneas Coffey patented a device that would shatter the limitations of traditional distilling forever. Some historians argue that without this specific invention, whisky would never have achieved its status as a ubiquitous global commodity. The coffee still, or column, still allowed for continuous distillation, producing a lighter and more consistent grain spirit at an unprecedented scale and speed. Initially, the traditional malt distillers of the Highlands looked upon this new grain whisky with profound disdain and skepticism. They argued that this industrial liquid lacked the soul, the smoke and the complex character of the spirit produced in their labour-intensive pot stills. This internal conflict threatened to tear the industry apart, as producers debated whether this new spirit could even be legally called whisky. Yet a group of visionary grocers in the lowlands saw an opportunity where others saw only a threat to tradition. Names that are now global icons such as John Walker and James Chivas began experimenting with the art of blending. By mixing the heavy, flavourful Highland malts with the lighter, smoother grain whiskies from the column stills, they created a product with broad appeal. These blended whiskies were more approachable for the delicate palates of the English middle class, who found the pure Highland malts too aggressive. Not only did blending provide a more consistent flavour profile, but it also made the spirit significantly more affordable for the masses. The rise of the brand was born in this era as these merchants used colourful labels and distinctive bottles to guarantee quality in a market once flooded with questionable liquids. Had the traditionalists succeeded in banning grain whisky, the global empire of Scotch might have crumbled before it even began. However, nature was about to intervene in the most unexpected and devastating way possible for Scotland's competitors. Across the English Channel, the French wine and brandy industries were being brought to their knees by a microscopic predator. The phylloxera beetle, an invasive pest from North America, was systematically destroying the vineyards of Europe, leading to a dramatic decline in cognac production. By the 1860s, the supply of French brandy, the preferred drink of the European elite, had practically evaporated. This biological catastrophe served as the perfect catalyst for the sudden and explosive growth of the Scotch whisky industry. With brandy off the table, the thirsty aristocrats of London and Paris turned their attention toward the newly refined and reliable blended Scotch. Consequently, Scotch whisky moved from the rugged backspreads of the north to the most prestigious crystal decanters of the British Empire. It was a classic example of a perfect storm where technology, branding and an environmental crisis aligned to change consumer behaviour forever. British soldiers and civil servants carried their favourite bottles of Scotch to every corner of the globe, from the heat of India to the ports of Hong Kong. Never before had a single spirit travelled so far or so fast, riding the waves of the most powerful navy in history. In this chapter, we have used advanced collocations like ubiquitous global commodity and biological catastrophe. These terms are excellent for describing widespread influence and large-scale natural events in academic or professional settings. Try using the phrase perfect storm when you want to describe a rare combination of circumstances that aggravate a situation or create a unique opportunity. If the railway networks had not expanded during this time, the logistics of transporting thousands of barrels to the coast would have been nearly impossible. The industry adapted with remarkable speed, investing heavily in infrastructure and sophisticated marketing campaigns that emphasised Scottish heritage. The image of the noble Highlander and the misty glen became powerful symbols used to sell a sense of authenticity and tradition to the modern world. As the 19th century drew to a close, Scotch had firmly established itself as the premier international spirit, far outstripping its rivals. The transition from a cottage industry to a global powerhouse was complete, yet new challenges were already lurking on the horizon. Across the Atlantic, a growing movement was beginning to question the morality of alcohol consumption entirely. This temperance movement would soon evolve into a legal hurricane that would threaten to dry up the world's most lucrative market. While the Scottish distillers were celebrating their victory over brandy, the shadow of prohibition was beginning to stretch across the United States. Within a decade, the noble experiment would criminalize the production and sale of alcohol in America, forcing the industry back into the shadows. The survival of the craft would once again depend on the ingenuity of those willing to operate outside the law. The golden age of the global trade was about to meet its most formidable opponent yet. The year was 1920, and a sudden eerie silence descended upon the thousands of saloons and bars that stretched from New York to San Francisco. In a sweeping legislative move known as the Noble Experiment, the United States government officially prohibited the production, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors. For the Scottish distillers, who had come to rely on the American market as their primary source of income, this was nothing short of a catastrophe. Some historians argue that prohibition should have been the final nail in the coffin for the whiskey industry, yet it ultimately became a catalyst for legendary ingenuity. While the law aimed to dry up the nation, it instead created a massive underground vacuum that was quickly filled by daring smugglers and opportunistic businessmen. Records vary on the exact volume of spirit that crossed the Atlantic during these dry years, but the impact on the industry's survival was undeniable. Never before had the concept of medicinal alcohol been exploited so creatively or on such a massive scale. One of the most fascinating loopholes in the Volstead Act allowed doctors to prescribe whiskey for a wide range of ailments from high blood pressure to simple exhaustion. Laphroaig, a distillery known for its intensely medicinal and peaty flavour, was famously allowed to be imported because the authorities believed no one would drink it for pleasure. They were convinced that a spirit smelling so strongly of iodine and seaweed could only be used for its purported health benefits. Consequently, Scottish exporters found themselves in the unique position of supplying medicine to a nation that was suddenly feeling very unwell. Beyond the legal loopholes, a more dangerous and lucrative trade was blossoming along the American coastline in an area known as Rum Row. Large cargo ships laden with thousands of cases of Scotch would anchor just outside the 3-mile limit of U.S. territorial waters. Under the cover of darkness, small high-speed boats would weave through the waves to collect the contraband and bring it to shore. The smugglers prioritized Scotch whisky because its high quality and recognizable brands allowed them to charge a premium in the illegal speakeasies. Had the American public been satisfied with poor quality domestic moonshine, the demand for authentic Scotch might have diminished during this period. Instead, the dry era actually reinforced the prestige of Scottish brands, cementing their reputation as the gold standard of distilled spirits. However, just as the clouds of prohibition began to clear in the early 1930s, a much darker storm was gathering over the European continent. The outbreak of World War II presented a new and existential threat to the industry, as grain was desperately needed to feed the population and the troops. Distilleries across Scotland were forced to close their doors, and many were repurposed as storage facilities or even barracks for soldiers. Inversion of priorities became the norm. Grain was for bread, not for the still, and the production of new whiskey ground to a halt. Yet even in the depths of war, the British government recognised that Scotch whisky was a vital strategic asset for the nation's economy. Winston Churchill himself famously intervened, ordering that grain supplies should not be completely cut off for the distillers. He understood that whisky was a hard currency that could be traded with the United States to pay for essential war materials and food. Rarely has a luxury item played such a critical role in the survival of a nation's treasury during a global conflict. While Europe was embroiled in war, a quiet revolution was taking place on the other side of the planet, in the mountains of Japan. A young man named Masataka Taketsuru had travelled to Scotland years earlier to apprentice at various distilleries and learn the secrets of the craft. He returned to Japan with a Scottish bride and a notebook filled with the technical details of pot stills and maturation processes. Alongside Shinjiro Tori, he helped establish the first authentic Japanese whiskey distillery, laying the foundation for an industry that would one day rival Scotland itself. If Taketsuru had not been so meticulous in his studies, the distinct and elegant style of Japanese whiskey might never have come to fruition. In this chapter, we have encountered terms like legal loophole and to weather the storm, which are common in both historical and business English. A loophole refers to a small mistake or omission in a law that allows people to avoid following it without actually breaking it. Try using to weather the storm in your advanced conversations when describing how a person or a company survives a difficult period. By the time the war ended in 1945, the global landscape had changed, but the appetite for Scotch whisky was stronger than it had ever been. The industry had survived the noble experiment, the Great Depression, and the most destructive war in human history. Innovation had been born out of necessity, and the brands that survived were now leaner, stronger, and ready for a new era of prosperity. The post-war boom would see whiskey become the definitive drink of the modern professional featured in countless films and advertisements. However, the focus was still largely on blended whiskey, while the original unblended malt spirits remained a hidden treasure known only to a few. Little did the big blending houses know that a single distillery in the Valley of the Deer was about to gamble its future on a radical new idea. The era of the single malt was lurking just around the corner, ready to redefine what it meant to be a connoisseur. Within 2 decades, the world would learn to appreciate the unique character of individual distilleries, shifting the industry's focus once again. The next chapter of our story explores how a bold marketing move in the 1960s sparked a global obsession with the pure spirit of the Highlands. As the smoke from the great wars of the 20th century finally cleared a new era of global consumption and cultural refinement began to take root. For decades, the whiskey industry had been defined by its ubiquity, with blended brands standing as the undisputed kings of the spirits world. However, beneath this surface of corporate consistency, a quiet revolution was simmering in the small traditional distilleries of the Scottish Highlands. Some historians argue that the modern appreciation for whiskey as a fine art form was born from a single daring marketing decision made in the early 1960s. At that time, the concept of drinking whiskey from a single distillery was considered an eccentric habit reserved for local farmers and distillery workers. Most consumers believed that a spirit needed to be blended to achieve the necessary smoothness and balance for a sophisticated palate. This perception was about to be shattered by the Grant family of Glenfiddich, who decided to launch their straight malt on an international scale in 1963. Initial reactions from the industry were skeptical, as many experts dismissed the move as a short-sighted gamble that would never find a global audience. Never before had a brand attempted to sell the raw, unadulterated character of a single location as a premium luxury product. If the Grant family had listened to the critics of their era, the global landscape of the spirits industry would look remarkably different today. Against all odds, the venture was a resounding success, capturing the imaginations of a new generation of drinkers who craved authenticity and story. This success sparked a malt renaissance, prompting other distilleries to dust off their own single malt stocks and present them to the world. As the 1980s dawned, the focus of the industry began to shift from the volume of production to the nuance of terroir and the science of maturation. Distillers started experimenting with wood finishes, aging their spirits in casks that had previously held sherry port or even fine French wines. This process allowed the whiskey to absorb complex layers of flavour, transforming the liquid into a multi-sensory experience that rewarded careful study. The rise of the whiskey connoisseur was no longer a niche phenomenon. It had become a global movement supported by festivals, magazines, and digital communities. Rarely has a beverage inspired such a profound level of academic interest and collective passion among its enthusiasts. As the 21st century approached, the old world of whiskey production found itself facing unexpected competition from the most unlikely of places. While Scotland remained the spiritual heartland of the craft countries like Japan, Taiwan, and even India began to produce spirits that challenged the status quo. In 2014, a Japanese single malt was named the best whiskey in the world by a leading critic, sending shockwaves through the traditional Scottish establishment. This development was a powerful reminder that while heritage is vital, innovation and technical precision are the true keys to modern excellence. The New World whiskies proved that with the right climate and a meticulous attention to detail, the spirit of Whisky Beatha could thrive anywhere. Consequently, the modern market is now a vibrant tapestry of flavours, ranging from the delicate florals of Japan to the bold tropical notes of Taiwanese malts. In this final chapter, we have utilised evocative phrases such as to send shockwaves and to take root to describe sudden changes and the beginning of movements. The expression short-sighted is an excellent academic adjective to describe a decision made without considering the long-term consequences. Try using against all odds in your advanced English writing to emphasize how a success was achieved despite significant difficulties or opposition. If modern distillers had not embraced transparency and sustainability, they might have lost the trust of the environmentally conscious younger generation. Today, the industry is moving toward green distilling, utilizing renewable energy and local ingredients to reduce the carbon footprint of every bottle. The water of life is now being produced with a deep respect for the very environment that provides its essential elements, grain water and wood. As we look to the future, whiskey has transformed from a crude monastic remedy into one of the most prestigious and sought-after assets on the planet. Rare bottles now fetch millions of dollars at auction, treated not merely as beverages, but as liquid history and stable financial investments. Yet despite this stratospheric rise in value, the heart of whiskey remains rooted in the simple act of sharing a dram with a friend. It is a spirit that has survived taxes, wars, and social upheavals, adapting at every turn without losing its essential character. The journey from a hidden highland still to a global icon is a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity and cultural tradition. The story of whisky is far from over, as new distilleries continue to open their doors from the rugged coast of Australia to the mountains of Scandinavia. Wherever there is a surplus of grain and a desire for craftsmanship, the legacy of the monks will continue to evolve and flourish. The next time you hold a glass of this golden liquid, remember that you are holding centuries of rebellion, innovation, and survival. It truly is the water of life.